Hi everybody, I'm State Representative Ken Gordon and welcome to another episode of Rapping with the Rep. This episode we're going to have sort of old home week because we're here with Rich Hosford from BCAT. Welcome.
Thank you.
From BCAT News. And I want to talk a little bit about the media and a little bit about some of the issues, some of the conversations going on, especially on a national level, that involve, my opinion and the way I'm going to put it is the free press. They involve propaganda and the way that we're looking at the media and the news that's being generated by the media and our attitude to it, because it bothers me somewhat, and I want to spend some time talking about it with Rich. And then I think halfway through the show what I'm going to do is turn it over to Rich, because since the point is going to be the opportunity for the free press to ask questions of political figures, really the most appropriate use of some of this time would be to turn it over to you and have you do that.
Absolutely.
So,
sounds fun.
This is what was behind what I thought about for this show. Last week, and this show will run a little bit, so let's say beginning of January, the President of the United States issued through a tweet and through, I think, a website, his view of the top 10 fake news outlets or fake news stories. Number one of his fake news was actually an opinion piece, which we all know is not news. It's someone's opinion. It was a prediction piece. And it's appalling to me. I was trained as a journalist. I spent the first 10 years of my career as a journalist to have a person who is a political figure, which is who I am now, to question the media, to question the motives, and to throw it out there that we should be distrustful of the messenger rather than analyzing the message that they're saying,
right.
Considering, well, what are we talking about? So I want to talk about that.
Okay. Yes, the so-called fake news, label that the president has tried to put on to so many, legitimate and hardworking journalists. Like you said, I actually have his fake news awards here.
Okay.
So we have, like you said, Paul Krugman and his sort of prediction about the economy at the time of the inauguration, which he then, like 3 days later, I think, came back and said, well, actually, it might not be as bad.
Right. But
and then,
at its heart, it was his opinion.
Right. Yeah.
And so
he's
you could
an analysis.
Right.
He's looking at what he's seeing, and I think there was concern. Usually when there's a major disruption at the presidential level, which some people might, have just said that, President Trump, his sort of being elected was disruptive in the nation. I think there was cause to possibly think that, well, this might have an impact on markets.
Right, and a disruption in this case means it causes things to change.
Right, yeah, I'm not saying for good or for bad, the election, just he was an unconventional candidate. I think even the people who support him appreciate and actually like that fact about him. So
right. Normally what would happen is that there's a story that comes out in the media, and the subject of that story, if they think that something was wrong, they say, well, this is what was wrong about it. It's not true because of this. And we don't immediately assume that it's wrong because somebody was intentionally out to get me. Right.
Yeah, it's the whole basis for libel laws. In order to be found libelous, you have to knowingly tell a falsehood against somebody. And the whole idea behind it being that, difficult to sort of prove libel is that, you don't want people just to be afraid of consequences just for simply making mistakes, because that causes a freeze on, reporting.
Right. And
essentially what the president's fake news claim, seeing as there's no legal, issue behind it or, force behind it, but at least, in the sort of the picture of the, that journalists or that organization's respectability, I think he's trying to intimidate people into not, covering certain things or covering him in certain ways.
Right. Intimidation is at the heart of what you're saying. He's trying to get the reporter to think twice before they report the news, because they're afraid that they might make a mistake. And if they make a mistake, they'll be branded a liar,
right,
distrustful, and their career will somehow, or their reputation will be called into question over what could turn out to be a mistake, because mistakes happen.
Right. And actually most of the things on his list were mistakes. Some of them, serious mistakes that, needed to be corrected, but I think in almost all cases they were corrected pretty quickly.
Right. I mean, what would it be if all of us, in whatever career we're in, when you make a mistake and then address the mistake, and then suddenly out in the public eye, you're seen as someone trying to essentially take down the country. We've seen that historically. We've seen historically leaders and they're authoritarian leaders, their first effort is to try to control the population by controlling the message and trying to get the media in line behind them so that he only has loyal media. And we see that there is certain media that he has loyal to him. He usually watches it in the morning.
Yeah, that's what we've heard, yeah.
That's what we've heard. That's what we've seen in a recent book, right? Which he calls completely fake.
Right.
And again, this is what happens. You know, when this president, kind of like me, right? One thing we have in common is we never ran. Well, that's not true. I never ran for public office before I became your state rep. He actually did run for president before he ran for president this time, but he denies it. But we'll put that.
Sure.
We'll put that aside. Let's say that we didn't run for office before, but we both had to be big, grown up about it and say this is going to attract criticism. This is, that will be fair game. So when a right-wing organization sends a postcard into a district talking about something I've done, if I think what they've done is mischaracterized what they see, all right, you know what?
As has happened.
As has happened. But I've signed up for this. And I can explain to people this is why, that bill didn't do what this card says it did. I don't get particularly angry because I knew that things like that would happen.
Right. Yeah, and in that, that's a political tactic or whatever. And I think, going back to Trump and who the audience is for the claim of fake news, I think is important too. Because one, like we said, we have the journalists who maybe are going to be intimidated, but I don't think most of them are. But two is also the country at large, the people who don't follow this day by day, don't really, people have lives to live. Not everybody's going to be on Twitter or reading Politico or Breitbart or let's hope, or these other things. We're kind of trying to get like both sides of the issue. I think the dangers of the president labeling major organizations like CNN or New York Times or Washington Post as fake news is that it just muddies the waters. People don't know what to trust, where to get information from. It's like a lot of like how the climate debate has been happening over the last 15 years. It's like, well, you've got all these scientists on one side and you've got a few naysayers, and the people who are trying to disclaim it are saying, well, we got two sides here, it's up for debate. And I think with the president saying all these organizations are fake news, and then there's a steady stream of more propaganda, the aforementioned Breitbart, I think, being one of them, it sort of makes people not know where they can turn to for solid, trustworthy information.
Yeah. Sometimes I think about someone who has an illness, and it's a serious illness, and they go to a doctor and says, get a second opinion, and the second opinion may confirm that, but they may go from doctor to doctor until they hear what they want to hear. Makes them feel better. There's nothing wrong with you. You're fine. And they rely on that one, because that sounds better.
Yeah, or they'll go to somebody, they'll go to a couple doctors, professional, practitioners, and then they'll go to somebody who wants to break out the crystals or something.
Yeah.
Purporting to be able to do the same thing, give them the relief they need, but it's not going to.
Yeah, because all of us would like to be reassured that everything is okay.
Right.
All of us would like to be reassured that all we need to do is go on doing what we're doing. Everything else is a panic. Everything else is a conspiracy, and we're okay. So we can continue to burn carbon monoxide at the same rate that we've been doing. It's all the fault of something else, or it's all a political ruse, and that would be comforting if, in the end of the day, we could continue to do this. But we know that almost every scientist out there says we can't.
Right. But people don't want to hear that.
And they don't want to hear that, and they sometimes find a place not to. When people go into journalism, when students out of school and we can talk to this, generally it seems to me people are going to do the right thing, that they want to be able to look at if they're a government reporter, local, state, or federal government, and tell the people what they see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think most journalists are hardest on themselves when they make a mistake. You don't want that out there. I mean, you have to, your sort of reputation and your view as being trustworthy is important to you, but also just getting the facts right so you're not misleading your viewers or your readers is your number one job. So,
to most people in the community, when you cover story, do you find that most people would just be helpful to you and say, this is the story, what's going on? Or is there becoming a prevalence of people, sort of looking at you as the people's enemy, as we hear it out of Washington. It's this other way of.
Well, thankfully, I think that local news is a little bit more cushioned against it. Because one, I know a lot of the people, in the town, or people who are, especially in the government side. I think I know just about everybody. But also a lot of the people who are active. I'll talk to them. I'll hear them. I mean, sometimes I'll not do the story that somebody wants, or at least not in the way that they want, and I'll hear about it. But no, I don't really feel like I'm getting like enemy of the people status.
Yeah, well, that's what's important from us on the political side. I think you're right. I think the idea that we reach out to the media and we recognize that you have a role here, that your watchdog role is important, that you're the people's friend, because you're telling them what you find to be important that they need to know, and we need to understand that that's your job. And to the extent that you have questions for us, we have to be available to answer those questions. And sometimes the best thing for us to do is reach out to you, so hey, here's where I am.
Yeah, I mean, that is always, and I think, even on the federal level, they do that. They'll put out statements that this is what we're working on, or this is what we're proposing, and it is helpful, not to have to follow you around all the time.
It was Thomas Jefferson that said, if given the choice between government and the free press, he would take the free press. Because, for that same reason, that, you're there to create transparency. And sometimes people in government, especially during campaign time, they say, we call on transparency. Well, if you do, then you're not going to interfere with reporters doing their job. And you'll understand every once in a while, if a reporter makes a mistake, you address the mistake. And usually they will as well.
Yeah, and I think that people shouldn't have any issue with, the president and his people arguing against some of the claims made in stories. I mean, I know that in there, on his list are some of the things about the Mueller probe and the Russia investigation. And if he really, thinks or believes that there was no collusion, there's no problem with him saying it. It's the trying to delegitimize the entire press and make people sort of question everything that they know that I think is the danger.
Yeah, to say there's no point in reporting on this because there is nothing here, so go away.
Right.
Well, that's stifling. That's stifling the press, and that's what he's really saying is no more coverage on something I don't want you to cover.
Right.
And the other issue that's concerning to me is the number of times they say that there's been no collusion found. Well, maybe that's because Mueller's not finished yet.
Yeah, and I mean, and part of this right now is also they're trying to delegitimize his entire investigation,
right.
Which is another sort of, I don't remember, I was younger when Ken Starr was at work. I don't remember how much the Clintons tried to, publicly discredit him as a person, but it's all reporting suggests Mueller is quite a respected guy. And,
well, yeah, and both sides came out in support of him when he was first named to this post.
Right, but I think now it's like, so if he comes up with something and it gets reported, the attack will not so much be on the information that he provides, but on the source and then the people who write the stories about it.
Right, it's blame the messenger.
Right.
The messenger may be the media, the reporter, or in this case, Mueller.
Right, or blame, actually even worse, I think, delegitimize the messenger.
Right, as a strategy to not be accountable, because in the end, we in government are accountable to the public, and we have to address these on a case-by-case basis.
Now, things are, you also have background on this. What are your thoughts on some of the responsibilities of the press and how have they been handling? So, for example, one of the number 6, CNN falsely edited a video to make it appear President Trump defiantly overfed fish during a visit with Japanese Prime Minister. Japanese Prime Minister actually led the way with the feeding. So we all remember it's a silly thing, but it's important. I think it's illustrative,
right?
Because we had this little video clip of President dumping out a bunch of fish food into a as like a part of a traditional fish feeding ceremony in Japan, and CNN did run with it, showing it, and sort of structured it as the president doesn't know what he's doing, making a fool of himself abroad. And it turned out that to be the case.
Right. But that comes under the category of, let's have a thick skin around here. So you were criticized for overfeeding the fish.
Right.
And I know that the second level of the criticism is so you're bumbling or something, like you can't even feed fish right or something like that. And that might be, but you know what? We get criticized for things. Again, we're in the public eye. We put ourselves here. Nobody made us run for public office. So if the media is we're going to put something out that makes us look less than dignified and something happened, I mean, so be it.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on you a little bit on that, actually.
Right.
Because I think that there's been such a rush to cover the president and sort of the uniqueness or unprecedentedness of Trump that every little thing they want to try to show, like, point out, make a big headline over. And I think that if they had just slowed down a little bit and saw the full video and not tried to make this breaking news, that that would have been the responsible thing to do. I think they can sort of set themselves up for this sort of criticism where just by trying to be too quick or too sensational over something silly. There's a lot of things that this president is doing that is very different from what we've done in the past and perhaps potentially damaging. I don't think you need to rush to highlight silly things.
Yeah, and it's sort of the two sides to the issue is that with the atmosphere that's been created, the hostility that's been created, it could be that, and I don't know this in this case, I'm not there, but it could be that there are people in the media that are quicker to act because there's this sort of, okay, I'll even the score with this, not that they're doing something intentionally false, but they don't check the source. They don't take as much care, and they should. But does that create the situation? Are you fanning those flames?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think you got to focus on what's actually important.
Right.
Don't focus on the silly stuff. I mean, we had, the inauguration, and then Sean Spicer, where the president claimed it was the biggest crowd ever. Right. And then Sean Spicer had to come out on sort of like destroy his own credibility by repeating that when we had photos next to each other. So then crowd side suddenly became an issue. And then somebody takes a picture at a crowd before people actually got in there and said, oh, President Trump's not drawing anybody. It turns out that's wrong too. They just hadn't arrived yet. That's on the list.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like, who cares?
Who cares? It's exactly
There's other things going on,
Yeah.
There's things like the deregulation, the real stories should be who is he putting in charge of the EPA, for example?
Right.
And what sort of regulations are being cut there. All these, same thing with Consumer Protection Agency. You put somebody in there that doesn't think that it should do what it does.
Right.
Focusing on whether or not there's a huge crowd or not is not helping anything.
It's not. You said it perfect. Who cares?
It's just distracting us.
So let's turn our attention then, and I'm going to halfway through the show. This is where we are, to things that I think we should be caring about, which is what we're doing in the state legislature. And specifically, I've been so busy, and I want to give you an opportunity to ask me some questions, this time substantively, about what we're doing in Beacon Hill to help the people of Massachusetts and Burlington. So now you can fire away. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that, like you said, you had sort of reached out and said what you've been working on, some of the things that you've been kind of busy with. And one of them that I think you have coming up now is something to address non-disclosure agreements and sexual harassment.
Right. I was going to make a joke and call that fake news, but no, it's true. I really did. And I call it confidentiality agreements. I know they're also called non-disclosure agreements. So there's been concern since the Harvey Weinstein allegations and the Me Too movement. And I've heard from some constituents here in the area that they're saying, what happens now is that people can engage in sexual harassment or discrimination, for that matter, and they get away with it in part because a victim will bring a claim, and they'll bring a claim in Massachusetts before the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. They've got to go there before they go to court. And if the MCAD finds cause that this could have existed, they'll immediately settle the claim with a confidentiality provision so that nobody knows it ever happened. The victim will be compensated through this negotiation for the damage, the emotional distress damage, but the public won't know that this ever happened. And so some of our constituents say, well, wait a minute, someone like Harvey Weinstein can do this over and over and over again. How can we put a stop to that? So there was some folks believe that what we can do is just abolish the enforcement of confidentiality provisions in these settlements and just say, okay, the victim can now talk. The problem with that is that it would now be very hard for a victim to bring their claim, because if they can't negotiate to give confidentiality, then there's really little motive for the company or the employer that harassed them to settle. And usually it's a trial is not something a victim wants to go through, a public description of what happened, a public explanation of what happened. And plus, most of the time, the victim doesn't want the publicity themselves.
Right.
So what this bill does is it takes the harassment, it breaks it into two situations. One is the situation where you have one victim and one harasser. So I was harassed at the workplace, this is what happened to me. The case is resolved, usually with a settlement and a confidentiality agreement, but the harasser never engages in that conduct again. And that's typical, where the harasser has now learned, I'll say his lesson, it can be a female as well, but it's usually a male. They've learned their lesson, and from a societal point of view, the problem is solved. That person is no longer going to do this. If we banned the confidentiality agreements, that situation would not be resolved that efficiently. It would go on to a trial and create a lot of discomfort. But currently, there's a standard that's called enhanced damages, and it affects situations where a harasser is found to have been responsible by the MCAD 2 or more times in 5 years, or 3 or more times in 7 years. So what this bill does, it says in the instances where you've got a harasser in that category, the Attorney General will be notified of the harassment. And then what will happen is that file will, the names of the victims will be redacted and any witnesses will be taken out. That means blackened out. And it will be made available to the public. Usually, the person from the public who will be the first to find out about it will be the lawyer for the next person that harasser has victimized. Because a lawyer will file their claim and say, hey, has this person been here before? So under current law, if there's been settlements, even 10 of them, the answer will be, we have no record of it, because there's all settled confidentiality before anything is released. Under this bill, the answer will be, actually, we have 10 findings. And that will be a very different negotiation to resolve that case. And if the Attorney General is involved, there'll be a full investigation, or there could be a full investigation if the Attorney General sees fit. In any case, we'll find out about what happened without the victim having to disclose it themselves. So they can sign confidentiality, but the story can get to the appropriate authorities in any case. So that's what this bill does.
So this works by, let's just say we have a company and, boss A and employee A, or whatever, and she brings a claim. What's the mechanism? Where does she have to, in order for this, even the first one to get logged as, something that eventually could, build to this, higher number? Where do they have to go through? Okay,
so currently what would happen, and under the bill, if a person believes they've been victim or subject to sexual harassment, they probably should, unless there's some reason why they can't, go to the HR department or somewhere up the chain within the company. Sometimes the harasser is so closely connected to HR, or there is no HR, that they can't. But in your typical situation, they'd report it to the company. If they don't get satisfaction, they go to the Mass Commission Against Discrimination within 300 days. And they file a claim there. They can have a lawyer, or they don't need a lawyer.
Okay.
And the MCAD then takes over, and for the next 3 months, they have the case in their jurisdiction.
Now, what's the I guess the rationale between, so somebody has 3 in a 5-year period, right?
2 and 5 or 3 and 7.
Okay,
right?
3 and 7. That then becomes public information.
Right. That then what would happen, and what would become public would be the finding against that person, not the confidentiality agreement itself. That really wouldn't matter. It's the finding. So the 2, let's say it's 2 and 5. So those 2 findings would then become public. The MCAD doesn't issue press releases, doesn't say we have 2 and 5. They would just maintain it. And now if there was a public records request, the public could learn about the 2 incidents from that harasser. And that's the difference. Right now it would be confidential until the whole file was resolved.
Now, is there any concern, obviously, we all want to believe everybody that comes forward, but is there any concern that having it public might, because I think you said in the language that it becomes public whether or not anything has been resolved, right?
Right.
So having something public before there's any resolution, if it is then resolved, is that still out there?
So right now, if someone files, say, a consumer case, a business case in court, the initial complaint is public.
Right.
Right, and that's not resolved. And then eventually, let's say,
most charges actually are out there and not resolved before they're resolved. So I guess it's the same kind
it's
of
the
thing.
same thing, right? Because then eventually there's a settlement, and the people say, "Well, I didn't prove my case, and I don't admit I did it, and we just both admit that rather than going all the way to trial, we're going to settle it in this way." And that would be similar to what would happen to this charge at the MCAD. It's just now you'd know it was there in the first place. And so if there were 10 scenarios that all sounded the same,
Right.
they were all resolved, maybe one could assume that the reason they were settled and maybe there was some credibility behind it if the story sounded the same.
So then what happens? We have, in this current scenario or the scenario, the first victim, they don't want to go public or they don't
Right.
want anything. But then there's victim number 4.
Right.
Does he or she have to try to pursue this legally in order for the state to take more action? Like, what's the mechanism that, makes this different, I guess?
Right. So number 4, let's say they get a lawyer. They can do it without a lawyer, but let's say the lawyer would know more about where to go.
Right.
So lawyer for number 4 goes to the MCAD and says, okay, I have a complaint against person A. And they say, okay, well, according to our files, there's been 4 findings against them. Not just a complaint filed against them, but the MCAD has gotten to the point where it's called a probable cause to credit the allegations of sexual harassment
Right.
or discrimination. And now they know that they can see that. Okay, what's this person done in the past? And they can compare the allegations to what they're looking at now, which will make the case a little bit easier. And for the most part, it will make the harasser or the company take a little bit more notice of what's going on in this case, because they can't say this is just a one-off situation and it's not what this person typically, this doesn't sound like this person or anything like that. Going to the Harvey Weinsteins, it means that victim 4 now knows that they're not alone. At some point, the victims might want to get together, as Harvey Weinsteins have done, because they'll know of each other at that point through the lawyer, if they're willing to come forward and
Right.
identify each other. If they're not, they can keep their confidentiality as well.
That was my question. I just wanted to ensure that victim 4 is not like, in order for anything to happen, they have to, they can't, break their own confidentiality or their own privacy. Because we
Right.
want to make sure that, everybody can, victim-wise, stay as private as they want to.
Right. Victims all control, and the MCAD cannot release the name of the victim without the written authority of the victim.
Okay.
In any case. The Attorney General, it says in the bill that the Attorney General can't either, but really the Attorney General wouldn't.
Right.
I did that a little bit to satisfy some of the interest groups.
Okay. And now this applies to...
When I say interest groups, it's not that they had that influence. As I showed the bill to a victim group called Jane Doe, and I showed it to the AG. I showed it to some of my colleagues, and I just wanted to make sure I had support of everybody.
Now, how does this address this is businesses.
Right.
How about, people in the State House? I know there's been some concerns about, that process too. Does this have anything to do with that, or what's the situation currently there? It
would apply to government entities municipal entities that we have authority over, like schools and things like that.
Okay.
The legislature, if really what you're asking, Yvonne Abraham has been doing some stories about the Senate, and before that it was the House. And we're a unique, we are unique in many ways, but we don't work essentially for the legislature. We work for the voters in our district. So we can't essentially be disciplined in the same way as others. Now, we are engaged in rewriting our code of conduct, our ethics rules, and our sexual harassment policy right now with the help of a couple of law firms and some outside experts. And I actually met with that group 2 weeks ago, where they're listening to input, because our goal is to make it absolutely clear that anybody who works for the legislature or comes through the legislature has a path to voice a complaint that path will not be one in which others are looking at them as they're doing it, in a literal sense or in a figurative sense, that they know that we want to hear about these complaints, because the problem with sexual harassment societally or through a government is it's a question of power. And for too much time, when women entered the workforce or entered government leadership, they had to go through conditions that men didn't have to. The welcoming, it just wasn't there. And so the fact that something was tolerated before is no excuse.
Right.
The fact that that people got away with something before is no excuse. We have to make our legislature an example. So a bill that I just filed, someone might say, oh yeah, that's easy for you to say, look what goes on in the legislature. So I'm also involved in, though not as writing the bill itself, because we are working on it, we have people writing it, but I'm involved in the input. For example, currently, to file a claim of sexual harassment in the legislature, someone has to physically file a complaint. And we were talking about how that would play out. And I said, I think more than said, I really forcefully said that we can't do that. We have to allow a victim to have a phone number so that they can anonymously, without being seen walking past that desk and that desk and that person, and what could they be doing here, right? They call in and they leave a message, and they're given, in my opinion, they're given a number so that they get a call back, so that the person doesn't have to say who they are. And this is what this person did to me. Well, do you want to know who you are? No, I'm a little afraid because I work for this person, right? And so I don't really want you to know who I am. I just want you to know that they did it. And maybe they're told, okay, we'll look into it, and they get the call back, number 36 or what have you. And you know what? It might be helpful because we have, let's hypothetically, this wasn't denied or you have some support. We'll treat you anonymously. The person who's calling does not work in HR, does not work in the legislature, does not work in the building, but this is a person assigned as an independent ombudsman kind of person, an independent advocate outside, perhaps in a law firm, where the law firm is rotated every 2 years, so they don't have a loyalty to whoever's paying the bill. And they know that I'll be protected. No one's going to know who I am, but I can reveal who I am to that person. And then maybe a little by little, they say, you know what, I realize that in order to really have this listened to, I'll have to show a little more. But it's up to them what they want to do.
No, but in that piece, like in the one that we talked about, is there any mechanism so that, let's say that phone number, that people call and someone says, so, I work for this person, he did this. Do they then have a list that say, well, okay, this is the 5th person that complained? Is that also going to be part of the way of keeping accountability, is sort of that tally? Yes,
that's the only way it would work.
Okay.
That's the only way that, because people have asked me, well, if you are anonymous, then what essentially what good would it do? Because they can't ask you, the alleged victim can't say, well, who even said this? Well, you know what? We're protecting the victim here. So the reason that that's still important is because the 3rd person that calls might say their name.
Right.
And you know that they're the 3rd person, not the 1st person. And you've been able to compare the story, and it was the same situation. The same thing happened.
Now, something similar, I know we're running low on time, but I
think you have some power at BCAT to get us a few more minutes.
Yeah, I think we have a little,
the right guy.
We have permission to go a little over if we decide to. There was another bill, I have it here, but I bet you know the name. That sort of also talked about when these cases come up, sexual harassment cases, where they are decided.
Yeah,
and I didn't even know this was an issue until that. Like there is actually I call them non-disclosure agreements or whatever, but confidential agreements where the company is able to say, well, okay, you can have this complaint, but it's going to be in a different state.
Right. So what happens is, and this is actually more common than you might think, especially among employers who are based in another state.
Right.
So they have employees in different places. And from their point of view, they don't want to have to figure out the laws of every state where they have employees. They want everybody to comply with their law. And usually the law they want them to comply with is the most beneficial to them.
Yeah, is this sort of like the case of, I don't know, like the patents, there's the patent trolls and everybody has they have a P.O. box in this one district in Texas that's like really favorable to that sort of case?
We get a lot of corporations that incorporate in Delaware, and,
Yeah.
and that's favorable. That's favorable, I think, tax treatment. I'm not a tax lawyer, but that's what I think is corporate treatment.
But they know
So
where
there
the
are-
law will work out in their favor, essentially.
Right. But many times it's not as nefarious as that. Many times it's because, for example, Bank of America, let's say, using that as, and I'm not saying they do it, but
Yeah.
if they were to, we know that they're headquartered in North Carolina. And many credit card companies are headquartered in North Dakota because those laws are beneficial credit-wise to those banks. So let's say it's a North Dakota bank rather than use a real name. And they say that you get your job. Now you've been unemployed for a little while, and they give you, as most employees, when you first get to work, they'll give you a stack of paper and they'll say, okay, we need you to fill out these forms. And you got your tax forms, you're going to take, how many deductions are you going to take, and your health insurance, which coverage do you want, who's your beneficiary, and all that. And in those documents, you sign an acknowledgement, usually it's in your employee manual, that says if you have a claim of discrimination you ever want to bring against us, then you agree you'll bring it in North Dakota under the laws of North Dakota. Because everybody who works here, no matter where you are in the country,
Right.
we all are treated the same. So you're going to come to North Dakota under North Dakota law, and you agree that you'll submit to arbitration. So you waive your right to a jury trial, right? So, and I filed this in the patent. This is the third session I filed in. The only controversy is that the federal government has what they call the Federal Arbitration Act, and they believe that they're the sole arbiter of arbitration. Anything that touches arbitration, the state can't get involved with. So we've been waiting to see what the Supreme Court says about that. There was a hearing in October, and they should rule on that by June, on that part of it. This bill actually doesn't say the word arbitration. It just says any, what we call pre-dispute waiver, which means if the dispute hasn't happened yet, and you're asked to waive your rights
Right.
to get into court, to use the laws of Massachusetts. See, I think if you hire workers in Massachusetts, you should use Massachusetts law. All our workers have a right to Massachusetts law. So on the sexual harassment part, the bill I just talked about, well, if you sexually harass in Massachusetts, but you agreed to the law of North Dakota, well, does this even apply to you? Maybe not.
Right. So what this would do is say, if you're hiring people in Massachusetts, and the event happens to them, they can go through the Massachusetts system.
Right. You don't waive your right to the Massachusetts system. It could be that after the event happens, you agree to go to arbitration, but you both know what happened.
Right.
So you can make a conscious choice of, this is better in arbitration. The problem with arbitration usually is the arbiter, even if it's subconsciously, they know who pays them. So, oftentimes the employee is at a disadvantage. You find these things in credit agreements and things like that too.
Right.
But yeah, that's what it would do. And that's a bill, that bill I've filed a few times. This bill you asked me about in the first instance is new. But working together, they would really protect victims
Right.
of harassment in the workplace.
Because if the first one doesn't go through and everything gets shifted to North Dakota or wherever, would that still get lodged? That complaint get lodged with the Massachusetts organization that is keeping this new tally?
No, there'd be a motion to dismiss,
Yeah.
and they'd say, excuse me, but you agreed to bring this case in North Dakota. What are you doing before the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination? We don't answer here.
Right.
And this U.S. Supreme Court has said, these are arm's length agreements. You knew what you were doing when you signed it. And we know the reality is, no, they're not. You just wanted the job. You were
Right.
thinking about the paycheck and feeding your family, not whether you were going to bring a claim for discrimination where you weren't discriminated yet. You just got there.
And, yeah, no, I think it makes sense. Last thing, just real quickly, something that we covered, I don't know, a year or two now, was the start of the paid family leave
Right.
program or bill. Where are we currently on that?
Well, I'm going to actually, the next Rapping with the Rep show, so we'll make that the last.
Okay.
I think you and I we're both decided, well, who signs off on this show now? Because
Yeah.
we both are taking a role in it. So we'll put it this way. I'm going to have I think our next show will talk about that because by the beginning of February, I think we're going to see that what we've done in Massachusetts with this bill that I filed calling for the opportunity for workers in Massachusetts to be paid while either they have their own injury, say a heart attack, non-workplace injury or illness, and they're convalescing, so it would be like short-term disability, or if they've had a child or adopted a child or have a parent that's gravely ill in the hospital for more than a week is how we define the illness, or a spouse. There would be a fund set up to pay them while they're out so that the employer can use their money to pay for the work to be the replacement work to be done while the person is out. You know, we talk about, we'll go full circle and talk about what happens in Washington, but they talk about negotiating and how things are deals and we can arrange for deals. Well, what we've been doing for the past month is that the employer side and the employee side of this conversation, which is to say the Raise Up Massachusetts people who have filed a ballot question on behalf of the employees, and then the organized advocates for the employers, which is the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, and the I think the Retailers of Massachusetts, I think, is there. They're all trying to hammer out a compromise to the needs of the Raise Up Massachusetts people and the employer side, so they can come out with something that they can all live with, and then that will result in this question being taken off of the ballot and the legislature passing this compromise through. And tomorrow I'm meeting with the governor's office to talk about what direction we might be headed. So I'm excited that here in Massachusetts we really do negotiate with each side to come out with the best legislation possible, taking into account all points of view, rather than freezing one out and talking about obstruction and blaming people when things stall out.
And
so
you're confident?
I think we're going to be able to get this done.
Because I know you like to keep the ballot questions. You're not a fan of them, as we've discussed before.
Yeah, direct democracy is important. But the issue with ballot questions is they're written by one side of an issue, and they've got to keep in mind that if they go too far, then they're not going to get the ballot question passed, and we see ballot questions get voted down all the time. But it's different than the legislative process where we conduct hearings, and we really can consider a lot of points of view that maybe we haven't thought about. So something they call unintended consequences really come to light earlier, and we can address them. Again, sometimes, as in any organization, things just need to be worked out. And if there are mistakes that can be fixed, we can fix them and do the best that we can. So folks, thank you very much for joining in, listening in on our conversation. It's been interesting to me, and I hope that you found it as interesting as well. Join me again next time on Rapping with the Rep. I'm State Representative Ken Gordon. Thank you very much to Rick Hosford, our guest.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rich.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rich.
All right.